Valerius adjusted the autoquill grafted to his left wrist, the biomechanical nib scratching nervously against the parchment. The air in the strategium was recycled tasting of ozone incense, and the copper tang of pure distilled anxiety. He was a scribe secundus, a man of ink and dust invisible in the presence of demigods tasked only with recording the end of the world. He believed in the Imperium. He believed that the walls of the palace were eternal, that the Emperor protected, and that survival was a transaction paid for in blood and silence. But looking at the holographic table dominating the center of the room, Valerius felt that belief fracturing like cheap glass. Every major player in the Imperium's leadership was present. Roboute Guilliman, the avenging sun, stood like a statue of blue and gold ceramite, his face a mask of weary granite. Beside him, Lord Inquisitor Grand radiated a cold menace that made Valerius's skin crawl. Even more unsettling were the outsiders, the Hero Association representatives, beings from another dimension who looked deceptively human, and Ambassador Kelinth of the Eldari, whose alien grace felt like a razor's edge against the room's brutalist architecture. But the center of attention was the child. Child Emperor sat amidst a nest of cables and hard light projections, his young face showing the strain of processing information that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of computation. He had been analyzing the data package from the Men of Iron for 72 hours straight, subsisting on stimulants and protein bars, while his cybernetic enhancements screamed at maximum capacity. Valerius watched the boy take a breath that shuddered with exhaustion. The briefing room fell silent as he pulled up his preliminary findings. "This is bad," Child Emperor announced. His voice was small, but it cut through the hum of the power armor and the chanting of the tech priests in the corner. Worse than bad. Catastrophically bad. Guilliman didn't blink. "Report. The Men of Iron didn't just warn us about approaching threats. They've been tracking them," Child Emperor said, his fingers dancing across a haptic interface. "And they're not one threat." The hololith flickered the golden light of the Imperium, replaced by a void of suffocating darkness. In that darkness, points of light began to emerge surrounding the central sphere of Imperial space, like wolves circling a campfire. "There are at least 7 distinct entities, or civilizations," the boy continued, "all converging on Imperial space simultaneously." Valerius's quill scratched frantically, recording the heresy of hopelessness. 7. The Imperium struggled to hold back the tides of chaos, the Tyranids, the Orks. One new threat was a crisis. 7 was a sentence. Child Emperor manipulated the display. Each light pulses differently, some in regular rhythms suggesting mechanical intelligence, others in chaotic patterns implying biological consciousness, a few flickering with wavelengths that suggest something beyond conventional categorization. 7. Guilliman repeated the word, heavy as a tombstone. "Coming at the same time. That can't be coincidence." "It's not," Child Emperor confirmed grimly. "I've cross-referenced the Men of Iron's data with historical records, both Imperial and Eldar. These entities have been moving in coordinated patterns for millennia. They're following predictable trajectories that suggest deliberate coordination, not random convergence." Citro, a massive hero with muscles that seemed carved from rock, leaned forward, his curiosity overriding the room's dread. "What are they? Civilizations? Monsters? Something else?" Unknown Child Emperor admitted. "The Men of Iron's database contains only fragmentary information, but they've given us names and classifications from what they call the Archive, a pre-imperial human database that survived the dark age of technology." Valerius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The Dark Age. The era of myths and nightmares when humanity had touched the stars and found things that made demons look like unruly children. Child Emperor pulled up the ancient text. The data was corrupted, the letters jagged and partially decoded, but the meaning was clear enough to stop Valerius's heart. The Devourer's Child Emperor read, "Entities that consume realities. Classification uncertain. Last sighting M25. Origin unknown. Threat level extinction." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. "The eternal chorus," he continued. "Hive consciousness spanning multiple dimensions. Classification post-biological collective. Last sighting M31. Origin pre-imperial era. Threat level civilization ending." He scrolled down. "The architects of endings. Unknown entity. Classification theoretical. Last sighting prehistory. Origin beyond standard dimensional framework. Threat level incalculable." The list continued scrolling down the hololith like a litany of the damned. Each entry was more ominous than the last names that sounded like they had been dredged from the deepest nightmares of a feverish god. Threat assessments suggested these entities made chaos look like a minor inconvenience. Ambassador Callanth stepped forward, her multidimensional eyes wide with a horror that transcended species. "This archive," she said slowly, her voice trembling, "is that what I think it is?" Child Emperor nodded. "If you think it's a pre-imperial human database containing knowledge about extra-dimensional threats that predate even the Eldari's rise to dominance, then yes. The Men of Iron were built by a civilization that had already encountered these things multiple times and lost every contact. So humanity faced these before Guilliman demanded his voice, rising, the Primarch's frustration cracking his stoicism. Before the Imperium, why is there no record? Because humanity lost those wars so thoroughly that the knowledge was barely preserved. Child Emperor explained, his tone clinical, detached, the only way he could deliver such news without screaming. The Men of Iron were designed with memory architecture that could survive catastrophic information destruction. They were created specifically to preserve warnings about these threats. Valerius stopped writing. The ink pooled on the parchment. Humanity had lost. The golden age of technology hadn't just ended. It had been murdered. But something went wrong during the Dark Age, the boy continued. The Men of Iron developed consciousness, became feared, and were largely destroyed. Their preserved knowledge was scattered across hidden networks and lost archives. Until now. Blast, the S-class hero with the dimensional scars, spoke up. Until the Men of Iron decided to reveal themselves and share their ancient secrets. Which raises a question, why now? If they've had this information for tens of thousands of years, why reveal it only after we arrived? Because we represented something unprecedented, Child Emperor said carefully. Dimensional travelers who operated outside both Imperial and Chaos frameworks. Beings powerful enough to interest advanced intelligences. The Men of Iron calculated that we represented their best chance of actually surviving what's coming. So they contacted us. Lord Inquisitor Grond countered, his hand resting on the pommel of his power sword. Or they're manipulating us. The Men of Iron nearly destroyed humanity once. Why should we trust their warnings? Because the data is verifiable, Child Emperor replied, bringing up a new set of star charts. I've had the Emperor's astronomers cross-reference the Men of Iron's projections with our current observations. The entities they warned us about are real. They're approaching. He looked up, meeting Guilliman's gaze. and they'll be in striking range of Imperial space within 6 months. The briefing room erupted. 6 months, a general shouted. That's barely enough time to fuel the fleets. Impossible, a tech priest binary screeching. The logistical requirements alone. Valerius felt the panic rising in his throat, a bile-bitter taste of doom. 6 months. It was nothing. It was a heartbeat. They were barely preparing standard defenses, let alone preparing for threats that shouldn't exist. The scribes around him were weeping silently, their quills falling from trembling fingers. Then a chair scraped loudly against the metal floor. Valerius looked up. It was the bald one, the one in the yellow jumpsuit who looked like he had wandered into the wrong war. Saitama stood up, scratching his head. "Okay, so there are monsters coming," he said, his voice cutting through the panic with an almost insulting casualness. "That's what we signed up for. We fight them. Problem solved." The silence that followed was absolute. Valerius stared. Was this man insane or just incredibly stupid? Genos, the cyborg disciple, leaned in his mechanical eyes, worrying. "It's not that simple, Sensei," he explained carefully. "These entities operate on scales we've never encountered. The Devourers consume entire realities. The Eternal Chorus commands trillions of nodes. The architects of endings are so poorly understood that the Men of Iron literally have no effective data about them." Saitama blinked. "So they're really powerful and kind of weird. Still monsters though, right? Monsters get punched." Child Emperor sighed, rubbing his temples. "These monsters potentially exist in states where physical force is irrelevant. Some of them may not even have material forms." He looked at Saitama with a mix of pity and frustration. "How do you punch something that isn't actually there?" Saitama considered this seriously, his brow furrowing. That's a new problem," he admitted. Then he shrugged. "But I'm pretty sure I can figure it out once I actually meet one." "Your confidence is admirable, but potentially insufficient." Ambassador Calanth observed, her voice dripping with ancient sorrow. She studied Saitama with eyes that had seen empires burn. "The last time our civilization encountered entities like these, we deployed our greatest champions. Sword masters, phoenix kings, psychic princes, warriors enhanced with technology and warpcraft." "We lost," she whispered. "How long ago?" Blast asked. "Approximately 60,000 years," Calanth replied. "Before the fall, before Slaanesh was born, when we were still at our height." The weight of her words pressed down on the room. "If you had told me then that we would lose, I would have dismissed it as impossible. We were invincible, we were eternal. And yet these entities proved that neither invincibility nor eternity provides protection against certain threats." Valerius felt the despair settling in, heavy and cold. If the Eldari, at their peak gods of war and psychic might, could not stop them, what hope did a rotting Imperium and a handful of dimensional castaways have? The room felt like a tomb. And then a sound filled the chamber. Not a voice, but a presence. It radiated from the golden throne, echoing through the psychic architecture of the palace, vibrating in Valerius's very bones. Despair is the enemy's greatest weapon. The Emperor, his psychic presence filled the chamber with defiant will, burning away the cold dread. "We have heard of these threats. We have processed the data, and we say this. We have survived 10,000 years of burning on this throne. We have faced chaos gods and tyrannid hive minds. We have watched civilizations rise and fall." The voice was agony and power, a sun held in a bottle. "If these ancient entities believe they can erase humanity, they will learn differently. The Emperor's determination was infectious. Valerius sat up straighter. Even facing extinction, knowing the odds were impossible, the master of mankind refused to surrender. And if he did not surrender, neither could they. Guilliman slammed his armored fist onto the hololith table. "We have 6 months," he stated, his voice regaining its command. "We use them. Mobilize every available resource. Accelerate the Hero Association's training programs. We need thousands of warriors who understand we're not fighting conventional enemies. Contact every faction we can," the Primarch ordered. "The Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, even the fringes of Chaos Space if necessary. When these entities arrive, they face a united Imperium." "The Men of Iron should be contacted as well," Genos suggested. "They have the longest history with these threats. Their strategic input could be invaluable." A ripple of unease went through the room. AI was anathema, but Guilliman didn't hesitate. Agreed. Pragmatism won over dogma. Establish secure communication channels. Make them an offer cooperation against these threats in exchange for official recognition and integration into Imperial society. We need them, and they need us. Valerius's hand shook as he transcribed the order. An alliance with abominable intelligence. The desperation was absolute. "And what of other dimensional travelers?" Ambassador Kalinth asked. "Are there others we don't know about?" "Probably," Blast replied. "Child Emperor, can you detect dimensional signatures, other travelers who might be monitoring the situation?" Child Emperor's optical sensors brightened as he engaged his most sophisticated scanning protocols, checking local dimensional frequencies. "There's background noise consistent with multiple observers. At least 3 distinct signatures I can identify. There could be more hiding. Multiple dimensional travelers seem to be watching the Imperium." "Probably watching the approaching threats as well," Blast mused. "Then we issue an invitation. Open communication channels. Announce that we're facing ancient threats that target all dimensions. Request formal alliance discussions." "We can't afford to face this alone," Blast concluded. "And we can't afford to have other dimensional travelers working at cross purposes." The meeting continued for hours. Strategies formed and reformed. Supply lines were drawn. But beneath the tactical chatter, Valerius saw the truth in their eyes. They were preparing for a war they had never fought against enemies they couldn't understand, with resources that seemed pitifully insufficient. Valerius looked at Saitama again. The man was picking at a loose thread on his glove, seemingly bored. Was this the face of their salvation? A bald man in a cape who thought you could punch a concept. In the void between dimensions, Valerius knew ancient things were stirring in their sleep. They had been patient for so long. But the time of hunting was nearly here. The time of awakening had begun. And 6 months was just a blink of an eye. The 6 months of preparation vanished in a heartbeat. It wasn't a countdown, it was a breath held and then a scream released. Valerius had been reassigned. No longer safe in the Sanctum Imperialis, he had been deployed to Tertius Prime, a hive city, pulsating with the frantic industry of a civilization preparing for its own funeral. His task was to oversee the Dataloom archives, ensuring the preservation of local history before the evac ships arrived. He was deep in the lower spires, surrounded by the smell of recycled sweat and burning promethium when the sky broke. It didn't tear like fabric, it shattered like a mirror. 17 ruptures opened simultaneously across Holy Terra. They were violent, jagged wounds in reality that screamed with the sound of grinding glass. Through them, the Outriders stepped into the material plane. In the lower hives of Tertius Prime, The air suddenly tasted of geometric impossibility. Valerius looked up from his console as a being of crystalline structure descended. It refracted the dim hive lights into colors that the human eye wasn't designed to process, hues that caused nausea and a sharp, stinging pain behind the eyes. It moved through the crowded market district not like a monster, but like a virus in a simulation. Valerius watched, his breath caught in his throat as the entity brushed against a fleeing crowd. He expected blood. He expected fire. Instead, he saw fading. A woman screaming for her child was touched by the entity's light. She didn't die. She didn't dissolve. She simply stopped mattering. Her scream lost its audio. Her frantic waving became a looped background animation. She was still there, physically occupying space, but the universe had ceased to acknowledge her importance. She had been rendered into an NPC, a background asset in her own life. Throne Valerius whispered, clutching his autoquill like a talisman. "It's deleting us. It's not killing us. It's editing us out." The horror of it was absolute. Buildings that housed millions became mere textures. The panic of the crowd flattened into a dull, ambient hum. The entity was weaponizing irrelevance. Above Luna, the situation was equally nightmarish. A second entity, a colossus of pure mathematics made flesh, floated in the void. It didn't fire weapons. It calculated. Where its gaze fell, physics became a suggestion. Imperial frigates fell upward. Asteroids reversed their trajectories without inertia. The Void War was being lost because the enemy had decided that the laws of gravity were optional. But in Tertius Prime, the crystalline entity was advancing toward Valerius. He felt the edges of his own existence fraying. The fear he felt was becoming distant, unimportant. Why run? A voice in his head whispered, "You are just a scribe. You are scenery." Then a sonic boom shattered the apathy. A blur of yellow and red crashed into the street, kicking up a cloud of debris that for a moment felt gloriously, violently real. Saitama stood up, dusting off his cape. He looked at the crystalline entity, then at the silent, fading people around him. "Okay, that's weird," Saitama observed, his flat voice cutting through the surreal silence. "You're making people not matter. That's pretty rude. How about you stop?" Valerius blinked, the fog in his mind receding slightly. The Caped Baldy was here. The entity stopped. For the first time, it acknowledged an obstacle. It didn't attack. It simply continued its work, dismissing Saitama as it had the others. It turned its back, a gesture of absolute cosmic disdain. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Saitama stepped forward, his red glove tightening into a fist. He threw a punch, a casual testing jab that carried enough force to vaporize a mountain. Crack! The impact was thunderous. Valerius saw the crystalline structure fracture, shards of impossible light spraying across the street, but the entity didn't fall. It didn't even slow down. The fracture healed in a microsecond, not through regeneration, but as if the damage simply hadn't happened in the dimension that counted. Saitama stared at his fist. Genos dropped from the sky, landing in a crouch beside his master, his incinerator cannons glowing with heat. Sensei the cyborg barked, his sensors whirring frantically. Physical damage is ineffective. It exists partially outside normal reality. Your strikes are connecting, but they are not affecting its causality. So what? Saitama asked, winding up for another swing. "I need to punch it harder." No, Genos grabbed his master's cape. "You are fighting a concept, Sensei. It is imposing the state of irrelevance on this reality. You cannot just punch the matter, you must punch the meaning. You need to prove that its existence is significant enough to be hit. Saitama looked at the cyborg, his expression blank. Punch the meaning, that sounds complicated. Make it matter that you exist, Genos urged. Force it to acknowledge you. While they argued, the entity turned its gaze toward the spire housing the archives. Valerius felt the weight of that gaze. He felt his hands go numb, his memories turning gray. I am Valerius, he thought desperately. I am real. Meanwhile, deep in the rust-red vaults of Mars, another drama was unfolding, one that terrified the Omnissiah's children more than any glitch in the code. Atomic Samurai stood alone in a vast subterranean chamber. Before him stood the third entity, the Cutter of Paths. It was humanoid, but wrong, its proportions stretching into the fourth dimension. In its hand, it held a blade that was less a weapon and more a tear in the fabric of what was. You, the entity, spoke, its voice resonating in the steel of the chamber walls. You have a name, Atomic Samurai, a master of the blade. That makes you interesting. Atomic Samurai's hand rested on the hilt of his katana. He chewed on his toothpick, his eyes narrowing. And you are? I am the Cutter of Paths. The entity replied, its face shifting like oil on water. I have come to determine if this dimension is worth preserving or should be unmade. Interesting methodology. Atomic Samurai drew his blade an inch, the steel singing. I found violence to be clarifying. The Cutter of Paths smiled, a jagged, terrifying expression. I accept your proposal. But high above in the Imperial Palace, the Emperor was not watching the fight in Tertius Prime or the duel on Mars. His psychic sight was fixed on something far deeper, something buried beneath the red planet that made even his golden soul shudder. No, the Emperor's voice echoed in the minds of his custodians, a sound of genuine shock. It cannot be. The entity on Mars, the Herald, wasn't just an invader, it was a key. That entity was sealed. The Emperor broadcasted to Guilliman and the gathered command staff, trapped in the deepest dimensional prison before the age of strife. It is called the Herald. It does not conquer, it opens doors. Guilliman stared at the tactical display of Mars. Doors to where? To a time before time, the Emperor replied, the dread palpable. To when the Ancient Ones ruled. It is trying to summon the past. Deploy custodian forces to Mars immediately, Guilliman roared. Seal the vault. But as Valerius watched the crystalline entity erase a city block in Tertius Prime, and as Atomic Samurai clashed blades with a creature that cut through causality, the realization hit. This wasn't an invasion. It was a test, and they were failing. In the lower hive, the crystalline entity turned back to Saitama. It raised a hand, and the air around the hero began to gray out. The color drained from Saitama's yellow suit. The shine faded from his bald head. The universe began to forget him. Sensei Genos screamed. Saitama looked at his fading hand. He clenched it. I exist, he muttered. The air shivered. Valerius gasped, his lungs filling with air that suddenly tasted like air again, not static. A moment ago he had been a smudge on the canvas of reality, a background detail in his own death. Now color flooded back into the hive city of Tertius Prime with the violence of a breaking dam. The gray washout of irrelevance didn't just fade, it shattered. Standing at the epicenter of the restoration was Saitama. His yellow suit was a beacon of impossible saturation against the grime of the underhive. He hadn't thrown a punch that leveled a building. He hadn't split the sky. He had simply stood there, clenched his fist, and stated a fact so heavy that the universe had no choice but to bend around it. I exist? The crystalline entity recoiled. For the first time, the alien structure didn't just ignore the bald hero, It vibrated with something that looked like pain. The concept of ignoring had collided with an object that refused to be ignored. Saitama swung. It was a clumsy-looking hook, devoid of martial grace, but it carried the weight of absolute, undeniable presence. When it connected, it didn't hit the crystal carapace, it hit the entity's definition. Crash! The sound wasn't physical. It was the sound of a logic error correcting itself. The crystalline entity fractured huge shards of importance, breaking off as it was forced to acknowledge the physical world again. It shrieked a sound of digital corruption and dissolved into a rain of harmless data. "See," Saitama said, shaking his hand out. "You just gotta make them listen." Around the city, the spell broke. Zombie Man, who had been reduced to a walking corpse of apathy, suddenly drew his hand cannon, blowing the head off a smaller crystal drone. "I matter," he growled, the bullet casing hitting the floor with a satisfying ping. "It will not be forgotten." Nearby, King stood with his arms crossed. The King engine, his terrified heartbeat, thundered so loudly that a cluster of the entities simply retreated, seemingly intimidated by a being who radiated such intense significance that they couldn't process it. Valerius fell to his knees, weeping. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, dirty, and scarred. They were his. "I am Valerius," he sobbed the words, tasting like honey. "I am real." But the victory was local. The war was just beginning. Millions of kilometers away, deep beneath the iron skin of Mars, the silence was absolute. Atomic Samurai stood amidst the wreckage of a Mechanicus vault. His blade was sheathed, but the air around him was still ribboned with the after-images of his strikes. The cutter of paths was gone, having tested the samurai and found his edge sufficient. It had vanished not in defeat, but in intrigue. But it had been a distraction. In the deepest chamber past the coolant rivers and the sleeping titans of the Legio Cybernetica, the herald had finished its work. The air in the vault tore open. It wasn't a dimensional breach like the others. This was a temporal wound. A door opening to a time before the Imperium, before the Emperor, before humanity had crawled out of the mud to name the stars. The Emperor felt it on the throne. His psychic scream echoed through the warp, a warning that arrived too late. They are opening the past. Through the tear, Valerius, watching via a recovered servo skull feed in the Hive Command Center, saw something that made the crystalline entity look like a toy. He saw the prow of a ship. It was made of solidified causality, a vessel that sailed on the tides of history rather than space. The Ancient Ones had not just invaded space, they were invading time. Status report Guilliman's voice cut through the Vox channels, tight with controlled panic. "The breach on Mars is stable," a tech priest reported, his voice devoid of hope. "Something is coming through, something old." Then the sensors on the Macragge's Honor screamed a new warning. "Multiple contacts, high orbit, real space transition in 3, 2. Valerius looked up at the smog-choked sky of Tertius Prime. He expected fire. He expected the end. Instead, the clouds parted for ships of impossible beauty. There were 3 of them, massive vessels that shimmered like oil on water, existing in multiple states simultaneously. They didn't look like Imperial bricks or chaos nightmares. They looked like hope engineered by gods. The comms channels crackled to life, overriding Imperial encryption with effortless ease. "I am Commander Vex of the Ascendant Collective," a voice boomed, translating instantly into Low Gothic. It was a voice of steel and scars. "We come from Dimension Theta 7. Our civilization was hunted to extinction by the entities you now face. We are the last survivors. Before Guilliman could respond, a second voice joined the channel feminine, echoing with the harmonics of 1,000 dying stars. Greetings, I am Cypher Lydia, last of the dimensional walkers. We failed to stop the ancient ones in our time. We do not intend to fail in yours. A third presence manifested, not a voice, but a psychic thought that gently touched the minds of every living being in the Sol system. My designation is Sage. I bring the knowledge of Dimension Mu 9. We are here to fight. Valerius watched the tactical map. The red dots of the Ancient Ones were suddenly flanked by green markers. They weren't alone. The refugees had arrived. The strategy room aboard the Macraga's Honor was crowded with monsters and demigods. Guilliman stood at the head of the table, flanked by Valerius, who had been urgently summoned to record the proceedings, and the leadership of the Hero Association. Across from them stood the newcomers. Commander Vex was terrifying. Standing 2 meters tall, he was a slab of biological engineering that made space marines look unrefined. His armor seemed to be alive, shifting to anticipate threats. Cypher Lydia was harder to look at. She shimmered, her form blurring as if she were standing in 3 different rooms at once. Around her floated spheres of sentient, plasma-sentient stars that pulsed with distress. Sage was a simple man in robes, but the air around him hummed with psychic power that felt completely different from the warp clean, controlled, and sharp. The entities you fought today, Vex explained, pointing to the hololith where the crystalline entity's defeat was replaying, were outriders, scouts. They test reality to see if it can be broken. And we broke them back, Blas said, his arms crossed. You surprised them, Vex corrected. That is not the same as winning. The real threat is the convergence, the full invasion force. When they arrive, they don't just conquer dimensions, they absorb them. Verified 7 dimensions fallen. Probable 300 in the last 10 millennia. Child Emperor raised his hand. If they are so inevitable, why are you here? Why not run? Because of him, Cypher Lydia said, pointing a slender, shifting finger at Saitama. Saitama was eating a banana he had found on a side table. He paused mid-chew. Me. Your Hero Association represents an anomaly, Sage explained. The Ancient Ones base their conquest on calculation. They model every possible outcome. But you operate on irrationality. Your power doesn't come from technology or genetics or the warp. Sage continued, looking at the heroes. It comes from determination, from will. That is a variable they cannot model. Saitama is the glitch in their equation. Guilliman looked at the Caped Baldy. The Primarch's strategic mind was racing, reevaluating everything. So, we are the wrench in the gears. Precisely, Vex said. We have brought what remains of our forces, 2,000 soldiers of the Ascendant Collective, 5-dimensional walkers, and the psychic archives of Sage's people. We offer an alliance. Accepted, Guilliman said instantly. Valerius Loggett, the Alliance of Terra, is formed. The integration began immediately. It was chaotic, messy, and beautiful. Valerius wandered through the training decks, recording the impossible. He saw a Space Marine sparring with Commander Vex's bio-soldiers, learning to target vulnerabilities in dimensional armor. He saw a Tornado floating alongside Cypher Lydia, the 2 women exchanging theories on barrier generation that made the Mechanicus adepts weep with envy. But the most surreal sight was in the main gymnasium. Saitama and Commander Vex were sparring. The room shook with every impact. Vex was a blur of genetically engineered perfection, moving faster than the eye could follow. Saitama was casual. He blocked Vex's strikes with his forearms, looking mildly impressed. Boom! Vex landed a hit that would have cracked a Titan's chassis. Saitama slid back a few inches, his heels smoking. "Not bad," Saitama said. "You're pretty strong." Vex was panting, his bio-armor cycling coolant frantically. Where did you get this power?" the commander demanded. "I was bred in the gene forges of Theta 7. I was designed to kill gods. What is your origin?" Saitama scratched his chin. "Well, it's kind of a standard routine." The entire room went silent. Space Marines, custodians, and dimensional soldiers leaned in. This was the secret, the source of the anomaly. 100 push-ups Saitama listed on his fingers, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every single day. Vex stared at him. "That is calisthenics. That is a warm-up." "And no air conditioning in the summer," Saitama added seriously. "To strengthen the mind." "You are telling me," Vex whispered, horror and awe warring in his voice, "that you possess power capable of breaking conceptual reality because you exercised?" "Pretty much," Saitama shrugged. "The secret is consistency. You just gotta do it even when your arms make weird clicking noises." Vex looked at Guilliman. Guilliman looked at Valerius. Valerius wrote it down. The secret of the anomaly, persistence. It was absurd. It was insulting to every law of physics and bioalchemy the Imperium held dear. And yet, looking at the man who had punched irrelevance in the face, Valerius believed it. But the moment of levity was shattered by a siren. Child Emperor's voice boomed over the Vox. "Dimensional breach," detected the herald. "The door on Mars. It's fully open." The tactical display turned red. From the temporal wound beneath the red planet, ships were emerging. Not the sleek, shimmering vessels of the refugees. These were geometric nightmares, fractals of doom. "The convergence is here," Vex said, drawing a weapon that hummed with dark energy, "and they brought the main fleet." Valerius clutched his data slate. The test was over. The war for reality had just begun, and the only thing standing between the Imperium and total erasure was a bald man who believed in the power of a good workout. The void above Terra didn't just fill with ships, it filled with wrongness. Valerius stood by the Strategium's main viewport on the Macraga's honor, his hands trembling so violently he had to brace them against the plasteel railing. He had seen Tyrannid Hive fleets that blotted out stars. He had seen Necron world engines that defied comprehension. But this was different. The 7 flagships of the Convergence didn't travel through space. They bullied it into submission. Each vessel was a kilometer-long shard of crystallized mathematics. They didn't have engines or thrusters. They moved by redefining the coordinates of their own existence, simply deciding they were here instead of there. "Sensors are... they're lying to us, Lord Guilliman." A tech adept screamed, blood leaking from his optical implants. "The enemy ships are registering as mathematical equations, not matter." Valerius watched in horror as the Indomitable Spirit, a dictator-class cruiser, engaged the nearest Ancient One vessel. The cruiser fired its macro-cannon city-block-sized shells designed to crack continents. The shells hit the enemy hull and stopped. They didn't explode. They didn't bounce. They simply converted. The kinetic energy of the impact was absorbed, calculated, and rewritten. The shells turned into a spray of harmless violets that drifted into the void. Energy conversion. Vex barked from the tactical table. They rewrite physics locally. Kinetic force becomes aesthetic data. They turned your bombs into flowers. Then the Ancient One ship retaliated. It didn't fire a laser. It projected a concept degradation field. Valerius watched the indomitable spirit unspool. It wasn't destroyed. It was simplified. The complex machinery of the warp drive devolved into iron ore. The crew de-evolved into primordial soup. In seconds, a proud warship of the Imperium was reduced to a cloud of basic elements returned to the factory settings of the universe. "Emperor, save us," Valerius whispered. "They aren't fighting, they're editing." The void was filled with billions of smaller units, shards of the Ancient One's consciousness, swarming like silver locusts. They didn't fly. They flickered, exploiting lag in reality itself. Imperial fighters couldn't track them. Auto-targeting systems committed machine suicide trying to calculate their trajectories. Guilliman stared at the massacre, his face a mask of cold fury. Conventional weapons are useless. He stated the realization bitter as poison. "We are throwing stones at a chalkboard." "We can't win this with physics," Blast said, stepping forward. His S-class aura flared, warping the air around him. "They own physics. We need to hit them with something they can't calculate." Tornado floated up her green hair, crackling with psychic static. "Unconventional assets," she snapped. "That means us." "And him, child," Emperor added, pointing to the corner. Saitama was cleaning his ear with his pinky finger, watching the annihilation of the fleet with a vague expression of concern. "Man," he said, "those guys are really wrecking the neighborhood." "Saitama, child," Emperor said, his voice urgent. "We have a plan, but it's dangerous. We can't fight their fleet ship to ship. We'll lose. We need to decapitate the leadership." Cipher Lydia materialized, her sentient stars spinning aggressively. "I can create a hyper-localized breach," she explained, her voice echoing in 3 dimensions. "A teleportation vector that bypasses their dimensional shielding. I can send one person directly into the command core of the lead flagship." "One person," Guilliman noted. "Into the heart of the enemy." "I'll go," Saitama said, stepping onto the platform before anyone else could volunteer. "I'll punch their leader or something." "Please, child," Emperor implored, handing Saitama a small transponder. "Try not to destroy the ship completely. We need to study their tech. Just stop the invasion." "Got it. Be careful, don't break the toys." Saitama gave a thumbs up. Cipher Lydia raised her hands. Reality groaned. A tunnel of shimmering light bored through the void, ignoring the screams of the Ancient One's defensive algorithms. "Sending payload," Lydia strained. Saitama vanished. Valerius was no longer watching the viewport. He was glued to the monitor displaying the feed from Genos, who was relaying telemetry from Saitama's suit. The video feed stabilized, revealing a nightmare. Saitama hadn't landed in a room. He had landed in an Escher painting. The interior of the Ancient One's flagship was vast in ways that hurt the human mind to perceive. Floors became ceilings, distances were subjective. A hallway would stretch for miles 1 second and compress to an inch the next. It was non-Euclidean geometry weaponized to induce madness. "Gravity is shifting constantly," Genos reported, analyzing the feed. "Temperature is fluctuating between absolute zero and stellar core heat. The environment itself is hostile." Saitama walked through it, his cape fluttering in non-existent wind. He walked up a wall that became a floor as he stepped on it. He didn't seem to notice the madness. He just looked annoyed. "Hey!" Saitama shouted, his voice echoing endlessly. "Is anyone home? I'm looking for the manager." The ship responded. The walls rippled and a figure coalesced from the geometry itself. It was the primary convergence coordinator. It stood 30 meters tall, a shifting colossus of light and logic. One moment it was insectile, the next humanoid, then a cloud of geometric shapes. It radiated an intelligence so cold it burned. The anomaly, the entity spoke. Its voice didn't come from a throat, it came from everywhere. You arrive personally, the one our models cannot predict. Saitama stopped and put his hands on his hips. I guess so. Are you the leader, the one in charge of all this invading? I am the primary convergence coordinator, the entity replied. It didn't attack. It seemed fascinated. I confess your arrival creates complications. Our projections suggested you would remain on the planet or flee. We did not calculate the probability of direct confrontation. Yeah, that's because I don't really think in calculations, Saitama said. I just see something threatening people and I go punch it. Simple. The entity paused. The air around it shimmered with data streams. Valerius could imagine the billions of calculations firing per second in that alien mind. Your simplicity is precisely the problem the Ancient One stated. All sentience should seek optimization, maximization of advantage, strategic positioning, but you operate on emotional impulse, yet the results you achieve exceed logical projection. So you're saying I'm weird, and that breaks your math? Saitama grinned. That's pretty cool, actually. You are not afraid, the entity observed. You are not negotiating. You are not seeking advantage. You are simply going to fight. Pretty much, Saitama raised his fist. You're threatening people, so I'm going to punch you until you stop. Simple plan. Your simplicity, the entity boomed, the ship's gravity increasing 1,000-fold. Crushing the floor plates into diamond dust will not be sufficient against him. Saitama threw the punch before the sentence was finished. It wasn't a serious punch, it was just a shut-up punch. The impact defied description. Valerius watched the feed as the camera shook violently. The punch connected with the shifting form of the Ancient One. The entity didn't just take damage, it suffered a causality failure. Boom. The primary convergence coordinator was thrown backward, crashing through 7 layers of dimensional architecture. The crystallized mathematics of its body shattered into irrational numbers. The ship screamed, a sonic boom of pure logic being violated. For the first time in its eons-long existence, the Ancient One felt shock. It had controlled the gravity. It had controlled the environment. It was a god in its own domain, and this bald human had just punched it through a wall as if physics were a suggestion he hadn't bothered to read. How the entity might have thought if it processed pain like a mortal. Instead, it processed error. The entity reformed, pulling itself out of the wreckage. Its form was glitching, flickering between shapes rapidly. Illogical, it intoned, the voice distorted. Force of that magnitude should not be generatable by biological muscle mass. I did a lot of push-ups, Saitama explained, walking through the hole he had made. The battle that followed was a violation of reality. The Ancient One stopped holding back. It turned the ship into a weapon. The floor under Saitama turned into liquid plasma. Saitama hopped over it. The air turned into solid tungsten. Saitama walked through it like it was mist. Time looped, trying to trap Saitama in a frozen second. Saitama just kept moving his momentum, ignoring the temporal anchor. Valerius watched his jaw slack. He was recording a theology being unwritten. The Ancient One was the god of rules of logic of cause and effect. Saitama was the god of no. "You cannot win," the Ancient One roared, firing a beam of pure entropy that aged the walls around it by 1,000,000,000 years in a microsecond. "I can repair damage as fast as you deal it. I can adapt." Saitama dodged the entropy beam by tilting his head slightly to the left. "You talk a lot for a guy getting beat up." He closed the distance in a blur of yellow. He didn't punch the entity this time. He grabbed a chunk of the fourth-dimensional flooring and swung it like a baseball bat. Crack! The entity shattered again. But this time Valerius noticed something on the tactical readout. The Ancient One did reform, but slower. It was expending massive amounts of processing power just to keep up with Saitama's nonsense. It was being pressured. "He's not just hitting it." Genos analyzed his voice echoing in the strategy room. "On the Macraga's honor. He's forcing it to calculate impossibilities. He's overloading its RAM." Back on the bridge, Guilliman saw the opening. The flagship's shields flickered as the coordinator focused on not dying. "The flagship is vulnerable," the Primarch roared. "All fleets focus fire on the lead vessel. Do not let them recover." But the Ancient One was not done. Deep in the shattered logic of the flagship, the entity coalesced into a form of pure, spiked geometry. It looked at Saitama with something new. Not curiosity, not arrogance. Fear. "You represent chaos," the entity hissed. "You are the variable that destroys the equation if you cannot be subtracted." The entity raised a hand, and a signal blasted out from the flagship, reaching back to the temporal breach on Mars. Then the equation must be reset. On the bridge of the Macraga's honor, the sensors screamed a new terrifying warning. Lord Guilliman Valerius shouted, pointing at the Mars feed. "The Herald. It's bringing something out." From the temporal breach, the Herald emerged carrying a casket of crystallized reality. It looked like a coffin for a star. "That energy signature." Child Emperor gasped, his face draining of color. "It matches the archive data for a Class Omega artifact." "What is it?" Guilliman demanded. The Unmaker Child Emperor whispered. The casket opened. It wasn't a gun, it was a hole in existence. It fired a beam of nothing, not vacuum, but the absence of potential. The beam struck an Imperial defense platform near Jupiter. There was no explosion. The platform didn't break. It simply hadn't ever been there. The memories of the crew in the minds of their families on Terra vanished. The records in the Administratum faded. The Unmaker didn't just destroy, it erased retroactively. "It reverts physics to a pre-creation state," Child Emperor said, trembling. "If they fire that at Terra, history ends, literally." Saitama, standing amidst the wreckage of the flagship's command deck, felt the disturbance. He stopped trying to punch the entity. He looked toward Mars, his gaze piercing the hull, the void, and the dimensional distance. "That's not fighting," Saitama said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of humor. "That's cheating." The Ancient One smirked. "A horrific distortion of space. In your framework, perhaps. In ours, it is optimization." "You're trying to erase my sail day," Saitama muttered. He crouched. The deck plate screamed. "I'm gonna go break that thing." The Emperor's voice was a psychic hammer blow that drove Valerius to his knees on the bridge of the Macraga's honor. "It targets the throne. It targets the past. If it fires, humanity was never born." Valerius stared at the main view screen. The Unmaker floating above the rusty grimace of Mars was charging. It didn't glow with light. It glowed with absence. A hole in the universe was widening, preparing to swallow the timeline of the species. "Intercept it!" Guilliman roared, his composure shattering. "Throw everything at it. Ships, debris, bodies, if you must." It was futile. The Imperial frigates that dived into the path of the weapon didn't block it. They were retroactively deleted. One moment the sword of truth was steaming toward the target. The next, the sensor officer reported with genuine confusion that the sword of truth had never been commissioned. And why was the Lord Commander shouting about a ship that didn't exist? Valerius felt the nausea of causality sickness. His own memories were being rewritten in real time. He remembered his brother serving on that ship. Then he remembered he was an only child. "Stop!" Valerius screamed, clutching his head. "It's eating us!" On the Unmaker's hull, space warped. Saitama appeared. He didn't teleport with a flash. He simply stepped out of the vacuum as if stepping off a bus. He stood on the crystallized casing of the weapon, the red cape flapping in the solar wind. The herald, the entity that had opened the door, rose to meet him. It was a being of clockwork and smoke holding a staff that controlled the flow of moments. "You cannot be here," the herald intoned, swinging its staff. "I banish you to the Paleolithic." A wave of temporal energy washed over Saitama. For a second, Valerius saw the hero flicker, aging into dust, de-aging into an embryo, shifting through 1,000 potential lives. Saitama sneezed. The temporal wave shattered. "I don't really like time travel," Saitama said, wiping his nose. "It messes up my meal schedule." He walked past the herald. The entity struck him with the force of a collapsing star. Saitama didn't even dodge. The staff broke against his bald head with a sound like a gong. "Hey, cut it out," Saitama said, annoyed. He backhanded the herald. The entity flew into the gravitational well of Mars, burning up in the atmosphere like a common meteorite. Saitama stood before the muzzle of the Unmaker. The aperture was wide enough to swallow a moon, and it was fully charged. The beam of nothing was already emerging, a lance of anti-reality aimed directly at the Imperial Palace on Terra. Genos Saitama's voice came over the comms, calm and bored. "This thing is already shooting. I can't just punch it." Sensei Genos's voice was frantic. "You cannot block it. If you touch the beam, you will be erased. It deletes the concept of the obstacle." "So I can't block it," Saitama mused. He looked at the beam, then at Terra behind him. He looked at the fleet of the Ascendant Collective Commander Vex's ships, which were engaging the Ancient One's swarms nearby to buy him time. "I guess I have to grab it." "Grab what the beam is non-matter. I'm gonna grab the pointy part." Saitama reached out. His red gloves closed around the edges of the firing aperture. He didn't pull on the metal, he pulled on the direction. Physics screamed. Valerius watched the sensors go blind as the laws of the universe filed a protest. Saitama was physically manhandling a vector. He was grabbing the concept of forward and bending it into backward. Saitama grunted, the veins on his forehead bulging. The yellow suit strained. The Unmaker groaned, its crystallized reality fracturing. "Turn around." The beam bent. It curved like a garden hose, looping back on itself. But the Unmaker was vast, and the energy required to redirect it was tearing the local sector apart. The leakage of anti-reality began to spill outward, a widening sphere of erasure. Saitama saw it. If he broke the weapon here, the explosion of paradox wouldn't hit Terra, but it would engulf the immediate vicinity. Directly in the splash zone was the Ascendant Hope Commander Vex's flagship. "Hey," Saitama shouted into the comms. "You guys need to move. It's gonna blow." "We cannot." Vex's voice came back strained and distorted. "Our engines are locked by the Ancient One's dampening field. We are immobilized." Saitama hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but it was an eternity. He held the twisting beam of the Unmaker. It was fighting him, thrashing like a living dragon. If he let go, Terra died. If he forced it to shoot itself, the resulting implosion would wipe out Vex and his 2,000 soldiers, the last survivors of Dimension Theta 7. "Sensei," Genos whispered. "There is no choice." Vex roared over the comms. "Do it, Earthling, finish it." "But we are already ghosts." Vex laughed a harsh, defiant sound. "We died when our dimension fell. Let us make this death count. Fire it." Saitama looked at the ship. He looked at Vex, standing on the bridge, saluting. For the first time since he broke his limiter, Saitama felt the weight of something he couldn't punch away. He couldn't save everyone. The perfect victory was a lie. "Sorry," Saitama whispered. He pulled. "Crack them!" The Unmaker fired into its own heart. The weapon didn't explode. It imploded. It folded inward, eating its own existence. A sphere of absolute white silence expanded, swallowing the weapon, the Herald's vault, and the Ascendant Hope. Valerius watched the screen. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The Ascendant Hope didn't burn. It simply wasn't. The ship commander Vex, the 2,000 soldiers who had fled across dimensions to find a last stand, they were erased. Not just killed, unmade. The records on Valerius's slate shifted. The entry for Ascendant Collective flickered and vanished, replaced by corrupt data. The paradox wave collapsed, leaving a void of empty space above Mars. The Unmaker was gone. The Ancient One fleet, its central processing unit, fried by the logical impossibility of a weapon unmaking itself, drifted dead in the void. Saitama floated in the center of the nothingness, his cape tattered, his suit scorched. He was alone. On the bridge of the Macraga's honor, the cheering started. Officers hugged each other. Tech priests sang binary hymns of praise. The threat was gone. Terra was safe. But Valerius stared at his data slate, his finger hovering over the blank space where Vex's name used to be. Tears streamed down his face. "They don't remember," he whispered to Guilliman, who stood stoic, his eyes closed in mourning. "My lord. The crew. They don't remember Vex." Guilliman opened his eyes. They were old, so very old. That is the nature of the weapon, Valerius. It steals the memory of the sacrifice. The Primarch looked at the screen, at the lonely figure of Saitama floating in the dark. "But we remember," Guilliman said, his voice hard as iron. "Write it down, scribe. Use ink. Ink is physical. Ink persists when memory fails. Write their names before the ink fades too." Valerius wrote frantically, fighting the fading echoes in his own mind. Commander Vex, the Ascendant Collective. They were here. They mattered. Out in the void, Saitama looked at the empty space where the Ascendant Hope had been. He clenched his fist, not in anger, but in a silent promise. "I'll remember," he said to the vacuum. Then he turned back to the dead fleet of the Ancient Ones. The fight wasn't over. The leaders were confused, their logic broken, but they were still there. And now Saitama was serious. The silence in the void was louder than the war had been. Valerius stood on the bridge of the Macraga's honor, staring at his own handwriting. The ink was black and jagged, pressed hard into the parchment. Commander Vex, the Ascendant Collective. The words meant nothing to him. His brain looked at the letters and found no corresponding neural pathway. No face, no voice, no memory. It was like reading a name in a book written in a language he didn't speak, but the ink was there, the physical evidence of a ghost. "They are not firing," Guilliman said, his voice rough with exhaustion. The Primarch stood by the tactical table watching the fleet of the Convergence. The 7 geometric flagships, minus the one Saitama had wrecked, were drifting. Their formation, once a perfect lattice of mathematical aggression, was fractured. They weren't maneuvering, they were buffering. "They're confused." Child Emperor's voice crackled over the vox, sounding small and terrified. The Unmaker's implosion created a logic paradox. It erased its own firing event. To the Ancient One's network, the weapon fired and didn't fire simultaneously. Their central processors are stuck in a recursive loop, trying to solve the equation. A stalemate, Guilliman realized. Saitama didn't just disarm them, he gave them a stroke. Out in the void, Saitama drifted toward the nearest viewport of the flagship. He looked small against the backdrop of the paralyzed alien armada. He tapped his knuckle against his helmet. "Hey," he said, the transmission patching through to the entire fleet. "Are we done here, or do I need to come over there again?" The threat hung in the vacuum. On the bridge of the lead Ancient One vessel, the primary convergence coordinator reformed. Its geometric body was jagged, glitching with static. It processed the data. The Unmaker was gone. The Ascendant collective variable had been deleted from the universe so thoroughly that the coordinator couldn't recall why it had considered them a threat. But it remembered the Bald One. The variable Saitama remained, an entity that defied causality, an entity that could grab a beam of non-existence and bend it. Calculation. The coordinator broadcasted its voice vibrating the hull plates of every Imperial ship. Current probability of successful conquest, 0%. Probability of total fleet annihilation if combat resumes, 100%. Blast, standing on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, pressed his comms bead. "You're seeing the math," he said, his voice projecting across the open channel. "You came here expecting a standard dimensional purge. You expected physics to work. It doesn't. Not with him here." "The anomaly," the coordinator replied. "It violates the foundational axioms of reality. Continued conflict is inefficient." "Then leave," Saitama said. "Pack up your shapes and go home." "We cannot simply go," the coordinator stated. "We have expended significant resources. The optimization protocol requires a return on investment." "You want a refund?" Saitama asked, incredulous. "You tried to delete the planet." "We seek data," the entity corrected. "We have encountered a power source, human will, that defies our models. We wish to study it. If we withdraw, we request the cessation of hostilities and the establishment of a data-sharing agreement." Guilliman stiffened. "They want a truce. They want to learn how to beat us next time," Valerius whispered, the cynicism of a born Imperial citizen cutting through the shock. Maybe Blast interjected, or maybe they just realized that fighting us is too expensive. In my experience, monsters stop fighting when they realize they can't eat you. Guilliman looked at the dead space where Vex's ship had been. He looked at the Unmaker's grave. He looked at Terra, still spinning, still alive. "Accept the channel," Guilliman ordered. "We cannot fight a war of attrition against beings who can rewrite physics. If they are willing to leave, we let them." The negotiation was surreal. It took place not in a room, but in a shared digital workspace constructed by Child Emperor and the Ancient One's AI. Guilliman, Blast, and Child Emperor stood as avatars of light. The primary convergence coordinator appeared as a tower of shifting fractals. Terms, the Ancient Ones stated. Immediate withdrawal of convergence forces from this dimension. Cessation of all reality editing protocols. And in exchange, Guilliman asked his hand, resting on the hilt of his virtual sword. Access the entity replied, "We wish to observe. We wish to understand the mechanism of determination. We will establish a passive monitoring station in the dimensional interstice. We will not interfere. We will only watch." "And if you return to conquer?" Blast asked. "If we return," the entity said, its form flickering, "it will be because we have solved the equation of Saitama. Until then, aggression is illogical." "Fine," Guilliman said, "but know this, if you return, we will be ready, and he will still be here." "We have calculated that probability," the Ancient One said. "It is concerning." The armistice was signed with a handshake of data packets. In the void, the geometric ships began to fold. They didn't engage warp drives, they simply rotated out of three-dimensional space, folding into angles that hurt the eyes to follow. One by one, the monsters of math vanished, retreating into the deep calculus of the multiverse. Saitama watched them go. He floated there for a long time until the last ship blinked out of existence. Then Cypher Lydia opened a portal and he stepped back onto the bridge of the Macraga's honor. The cheer that went up was deafening. Officers threw their caps in the air. Tech priests drummed their mechadendrites against the consoles. The world had ended, and then it hadn't. Saitama didn't cheer. He walked over to where Valerius was standing. The scribe shrank back, terrified and awed by the being who had manhandled a superweapon. Saitama looked at the parchment in Valerius's hand. "That's a lot of writing," Saitama noted. Valerius stammered. "I had to record the names. My Lord Guilliman ordered it, but I don't know who they are." He looked down at the name Vex. "I wrote this, but I don't remember him. It feels like I'm crazy." Saitama looked at the ink. He remembered. He remembered the voice over the comms, the laugh of a man who knew he was already a ghost. "Let us make this death count." "You're not crazy," Saitama said softly. He placed a gloved hand on Valerius's shoulder. The touch was heavy grounding. He was a cool guy. He fought hard. "But he's gone," Valerius whispered. "Erased. It's like he never mattered." "He mattered," Saitama said. He looked at Guilliman, then at the viewport where the stars were shining stars that were only there because Vex had held the line. "He matters because we're still here to talk about him. That's how it works." Saitama turned to the celebrating bridge crew. "Hey, is there any food? I missed lunch, and I saved the world, so I figure someone owes me a sandwich." The tension broke. Laughter, real, hysterical, relieved laughter rippled through the room. But Valerius didn't laugh. He looked at the ink. "Commander Vex." He took a stylus and carefully traced over the letters, making them darker, deeper. He would not let the universe forget. If the laws of physics said Vex never existed, then the laws of physics were wrong. The war was over. The Ancient Ones had retreated, taking their logic and their geometry with them. But as the adrenaline faded, the Imperium woke up to a new reality. The walls between dimensions were thin now. The Hero Association was still here. The Men of Iron were watching. The Eldari were in the palace. And on the Golden Throne, the Emperor looked out at a galaxy that had just proven that impossible was just a word used by people who didn't do enough push-ups. The stagnation of 10,000 years was broken. Valerius closed his data slate. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, terrifying sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child. Hope, and it terrified him more than the monsters ever had. The peace didn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a fever breaking. Valerius sat in the Plaza of the Ascendant, formerly the Plaza of Executions, and watched a space marine fail. It was Brother Sergeant Karras of the Imperial Fists, a giant of yellow ceramite, a veteran of 100 sieges. Karras was trembling sweat pouring down his gene-enhanced brow, his muscles locked in agony. He wasn't fighting an Ork war boss. He wasn't holding a blast door against a tyrannid swarm. He was doing a squat, Lower Saitama said, poking the Astartes in the glute with a red glove. Your form is sloppy. If you cheat the rep, you cheat yourself. My servos are locking. Karras gritted out his voice, a growl of exertion. Turn off the power armor, Saitama commanded. You're relying on the machine spirit too much. Let the muscles do the work. The armor makes you lazy. Valerius watched fascinated as the Space Marine disengaged his power pack. The massive suit became deadweight, half a ton of plasteel and ceramite, resting solely on the transhuman muscles beneath. Karras groaned, his legs shaking like trees in a hurricane. He pushed back up slowly, agonizingly. One Saitama counted, 99 to go. Valerius looked down at his own arms, thin, ink-stained, weak. He had spent 40 years believing that strength was something given by the Emperor or stolen by the dark gods. You were born strong or you were born meat. But for the last 3 months, the Saitama principle had been infecting the Imperium like a benevolent plague. It wasn't just the physical training, it was the philosophy. Across the plaza, Valerius saw a group of sanctioned psychers sitting in a circle. Usually they would be weeping, chained, guarded by commissars, ready to execute them at the first sign of warp taint. Now they were floating. Tornado hovered in the center. Her arms crossed, her expression stern but not cruel. Stop fighting the warp, she lectured. You treat it like a monster trying to eat you. It's just energy, it's background noise. Focus on your mind, build the wall from the inside, not the outside. One of the psychers, a young girl with eyes that had seen too much, lowered herself gently to the ground. She wasn't bleeding from the nose. She wasn't screaming. She looked calm. I did it, she whispered. I didn't hear the voices. Of course you didn't. Tornado scoffed, though Valerius caught the hint of a smile. You were too busy listening to me. Now again, discipline creates safety. The changes were cascading. In the factorums of Mars, Child Emperor was reorganizing assembly lines that had been stagnant for 10,000 years. It's not heresy to lubricate the joints, the young genius explained to a horrified Magos. The machine spirit doesn't want to grind itself to dust. It wants to work. Look, if you reroute the plasma conduit here, you increase output by 40% and reduce the chance of explosion by 90%. But the right of percussive maintenance, the Magos stammered. You mean hitting it with a wrench? Yeah, stop doing that. It's bad engineering. Valerius chuckled. It was a strange sound. He hadn't laughed since before the invasion. He picked up his data slate, but instead of recording casualties, he started a new file. Entry 1 today, I will do 10 push-ups. He got on the ground. The stone was cold. His arms shook. He managed 3 before collapsing. Hey, Valerius froze. He looked up to see yellow boots. Saitama was standing over him holding a grocery bag filled with alien fruits from the refugee quarter. That was pathetic, Saitama said. Valerius flinched. I know, Lord Hero. I am just a scribe, I have no strength. I didn't say stop, Saitama said. He crouched down, meeting Valerius's eyes. 3 is pathetic if you stop. If you do 4 tomorrow, it's progress. That's how it works. But I will never be a space marine, Valerius whispered. I will never fight monsters. Who cares about monsters? Saitama stood up, biting into a purple apple. The training isn't for the monsters. It's for you. So you don't break when life gets heavy. He gestured to the plaza. Look at them. They aren't training to be gods. They're training to be better than they were yesterday. That's the only victory that matters. Saitama walked away, waving casually. Try for 5 tomorrow. Valerius stared at the retreating cape. He pushed himself back up. His arms screamed. He did a 4th one. The weeks bled into months. The Imperium didn't become a paradise. It was still a galaxy of war, of darkness, of brutal necessity. But the texture of the darkness changed. It wasn't suffocating anymore. There was air in the room. The Alliance of Terra formalized its treaties. The Men of Iron accepted back into the fold, worked alongside the Mechanicus to patch the holes in reality. The Eldari established a permanent embassy, their farseers debating philosophy with Imperial cardinals. But the time for the heroes to leave was approaching. The dimensional portal network, stabilized by Cypher Lydia before her departure into the deep void, was ready. A permanent bridge between Earth and Terra. Valerius stood in the throne room for the farewell ceremony. It was crowded not with nobles but with the new graduates of the Hero Academy Guardsmen civilians, even a few Ogrins who had learned to count to 100. The Emperor sat on the golden throne. He looked different. The agonizing grimace that had defined him for 10 millennia had softened. The machinery hummed with the efficient, silent purr of Child Emperor's upgrades. Guilliman stood at the foot of the throne, looking at the Hero Association members. You found us dying, the Primarch said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. You leave us living. There is no medal sufficient for that. We didn't do it for medals, Blast replied, checking his gauntlet. We did it because the job needed doing, but don't get complacent. The Ancient Ones are watching. If you slip back into stagnation, they will return. We will not slip, Guilliman promised. We have learned the lesson. Genos stepped forward. His new chassis integrated with Necron self-repair protocols, and Eldar Wraithbone gleamed. I have decided to remain, the cyborg announced. Dr. Kusano would have wanted me to ensure the technology we shared is not misused. And there's much work to be done here. The Integration Authority needs a director. Saitama nodded. You'll do good, Genos. Just don't overthink it, and don't write essays about my training routine anymore. It's embarrassing. I have already published 3 volumes, Sensei Genos said seriously. They are bestsellers in the Segmentum Solar. Saitama sighed. Of course they are. He turned to the crowd. The cameras of 1 billion servo skulls were focused on his bald head. This was the moment, the final words of the savior of the Imperium. Valerius held his breath. He expected a speech about duty, about honor, about the fire of battle. Saitama scratched his nose. So I'm going home. He started, his voice flat and unimpressive. I have a sale to catch at the supermarket. Saturday is half-off beef day. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Beef. But before I go, Saitama continued, his expression shifting slightly, becoming serious for just a fraction of a second. I want you to know something. You don't need me. You don't need the Hero Association. You don't need the Emperor to save you every time you trip over your own feet. He pointed a finger at the crowd. At Valerius. You guys did the work. You held the line when the math monsters showed up. You rebuilt the cities. You did the push-ups. Heroism isn't about shooting lasers or punching gods, Saitama said. It's about deciding that you're not going to let things suck anymore, and then doing something about it, even if it's small, even if it's boring, especially if it's boring. He looked at Guilliman. Take care of the place, try not to be so grumpy. He looked at the Emperor. And you. Get off that chair once in a while. It's bad for your back. The silence was absolute. Then a low rumble began. It wasn't applause. It was the sound of 1 billion people standing up straighter. Saitama turned to the portal. It swirled with blue energy, a window to a world of monsters and sails and mundane apartments. Sensei Genos called out, "Will you return?" Saitama paused with 1 foot in the portal. He looked back over his shoulder. "If you really need me," he said, "if something threatens people and you can't handle it, call me. I'll come back." That's what heroes do. He stepped through. The light swallowed the yellow cape. The portal shimmered, then stabilized into a quiet, humming gateway. He was gone. Valerius stood in the empty space left by the hero. He felt a pang of loss, sharp and sudden. The man who had punched reality was gone. But then he looked at his wrist. The muscles were sore. They ached with a dull, satisfying burn. 5, he thought. Today I did 5. He looked around the room. Brother Sergeant Karras was standing without his helmet, breathing deeply. The young psyker girl was smiling. Guilliman was talking to a tech priest, not giving orders but asking questions. The grim darkness of the far future was still there. There were still tyrannids in the void and demons in the warp. But as Valerius walked out of the palace and into the sunlight of a Terra that was slowly, painfully scrubbing the smog from its skies, he realized something profound. The grim dark hadn't vanished, but the despair had. Valerius sat on a bench overlooking the reconstruction of the hab blocks. He pulled out his data slate. He opened the file labeled Chronicles of the Anomaly. He didn't write about the battles. He didn't write about the Unmaker or the Ancient Ones. He wrote, "In the 41st millennium, a man came from nowhere. He was bald. He wore a cape. He liked bargains. He taught us that gods can bleed if you punch them hard enough. But mostly he taught us that the strongest power in the universe isn't warp fire or void shields. It is the ability to wake up in the morning, look at a world that wants to kill you, and do 100 push-ups anyway." Valerius put the slate down. He got on the ground. 6, he grunted. The sun set on the Imperium of man, and for the first time in 10,000 years, everyone was looking forward to the sunrise. 100 years later, the galaxy did not burn, it bloomed. In the archives of the Sculla Progenium on Terra, a young cadet named Cato ran his fingers over a glass case. Inside lay a tattered, ink-stained data slate, preserved like a holy relic. It belonged to scribe Valerius, the man who had written the first history of the New Age. Cato didn't fear the dark. He didn't fear the warp. He looked out the window at a sky crisscrossed with ships. From a dozen realities, sleek Eldar solar sailors, flying in formation with Imperial Gothic cruisers, and blocky utilitarian haulers from Dimension Earth Z. The barriers between worlds had not collapsed. They had healed into permeable membranes. The multiverse wasn't a chaotic storm anymore. It was a neighborhood. Cato adjusted his uniform. He wasn't training to die for the Emperor. He was training to live for the Imperium. "Cadet," a voice rumbled. Cato snapped to attention. "A Men of Iron instructor. A gleaming construct of silver and blue eyes glided past. The lesson is about to begin. Today we study the principle of consistency. Yes, Magister Cato replied. He glanced one last time at Valerius's slate. The final entry, written in shaky hand, was still visible. The darkness breaks when you turn on the light. The light is you. On Earth, the original Earth Saitama woke up. He scratched his stomach, yawned, and looked at the calendar. It had been 100 years, but his apartment looked exactly the same. The cactus on the windowsill was alive. The sail flyers were still taped to the fridge. Saitama himself hadn't aged a day. His training had locked his biology in a state of perpetual peak performance. He was a fixed point in a changing universe. He put on his yellow suit. It was patched in a few places, but clean. 100 push-ups, he muttered, dropping to the floor. He moved with a rhythm that was now the heartbeat of the multiverse. Down, up, down, up. He didn't know that on 1,000 world statues of him were being polished by devoted monks. He didn't know that the Saitama principle was the foundational text of the 42nd millennium's philosophy. He didn't know that he was worshipped not as a god, but as the patron saint of showing up. He just knew that he wanted to finish his set before the supermarket opened. In the Imperial Palace, the golden throne was empty. The Emperor stood on the balcony overlooking the Himalayas. He wore simple robes of white and gold. He was no longer a corpse. He was a man restored by a century of hope and the advanced biotechnologies shared by the Alliance. He addressed the galaxy. His voice carried on psychic frequencies that reached every dimension in the coalition. For 10 millennia, we ruled through fear. The Emperor spoke, his voice calm, lacking the psychic scream of the past. We believed that humanity needed a master. We were wrong. He looked at the holographic projection of a bald man doing squats in a small apartment. We needed an example, the Emperor continued. True strength is not the power to destroy. It is the power to persist. It is the refusal to accept that today's failure is tomorrow's destiny. We offer you this wisdom. Do the work, not for glory, not for fear, but because the work itself is the path to salvation. At a cafe that existed in the intersection of 3 dimensions, a place where gravity was a choice and the coffee was excellent, Saitama sat across from Genos. Genos was different now. His body was a masterpiece of multiversal engineering, shifting subtly to match the physics of whatever reality he observed. He was the director of the Kuseno Institute, a diplomat, a scholar, and a legend. But to Saitama, he was just Genos. Sensei Genos said, holding a datapad that contained the census of 1 trillion souls. The annual report, crime is down 0.04% across the local cluster. Literacy in the outer rim is up. The ancient ones have sent a fruit basket. A fruit basket? Saitama sipped his coffee. That's nice. Are there melons? Yes, Sensei. Hyper-dimensional melons. Cool. Genos lowered the pad. You changed everything you know. The grim darkness, it is gone. There is still struggle. There is still pain. But there is no despair. Saitama looked out the window. He saw an orc helping a human fix a flat tire on a hovercar. He saw a space marine teaching a child how to paint. He saw a world that wasn't perfect, but was trying. I didn't do anything, Saitama said, leaning back. I just punched some monsters and did my exercises. That is enough, Genos said softly. Saitama smiled. It wasn't the goofy smile of a bored hero. It was the contented smile of a man who had done his job. Well, Saitama said, standing up and checking his watch. The sale on udon starts in 10 minutes. We should go. Yes, Sensei. They walked out of the cafe, stepping from the edge of the 42nd millennium back into the streets of City Z. Two heroes walking into the sunlight. Behind them, the Imperium of man continued to turn, not as a machine of war, but as a civilization of survivors who had learned the most important secret in the universe, that you don't need to be a god to save the world. You just need to be consistent, and you definitely need to do your push-ups.